Welcome to Cleveland Conversations. I'm sure all of us that are watching this today have received an email from some obscure royal family member from some country that we may or may not have heard of, promising that we'll become a billionaire if we just give them a credit card or if we give them a bank account number. We've also all received text messages promising largesses from some government agency we may or may not have ever heard of. We've also heard a lot about things like election fraud and that type of thing. And all of these issues wrap around the general concern we have with cybersecurity. And this is a rapidly emerging and exciting, but also at times somewhat scary thing to talk about. Well, it's my pleasure to welcome today, to help us understand and unpack some of this, an international expert on cybersecurity and the law, Professor Brian Ray. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Let's just begin with the basics. For our audience who are not necessarily all attorneys and certainly are not necessarily all computer scientists, what is cybersecurity?
So cybersecurity, and I would add to that data privacy, are two overlapping areas that deal with securing and ensuring that only the people that have authorized access have access and nobody else to information in the digital form, right? So that's the data privacy. The cybersecurity side is making sure that you're protecting it. Cybersecurity extends broader than sensitive information. It can also include protecting things like trade secrets and other things. But broadly speaking, the overlap, and when we talk about cybersecurity and data privacy, we're largely focused on protecting sensitive information that could be used for something like identity theft or directly to get access to someone's personal accounts, bank accounts, social media accounts, email, other things like that.
Mm-hmm. And so much information is digitized these days. How does the law deal with this? What are some of the major legal principles that surround this area?
So in the United States, we actually have a siloed system at the federal level. We do not have a comprehensive data privacy law, nor do we have a comprehensive cybersecurity law. At the state level, there are a growing number of states, and California was the first one, that do have comprehensive consumer privacy laws that often have cybersecurity protections within them. At the federal level, there are a number of industries that have extensive regulation, financial services, healthcare, and then the Federal Trade Commission has broad authority, or at least has interpreted its authority to protect consumers from unfair and deceptive trade practices, to encompass extensive authority to ensure that when companies collect sensitive consumer data, they're protecting it and that their privacy policies are being enforced as written.
What about social media companies?
So social media companies fall under some of these authorities, state consumer privacy laws, the Federal Trade Commission. There are a broader set of issues related to social media platforms that are not directly privacy or cybersecurity, that are covered by a different set of laws that have been in debate for a while, which relate to the liability that those companies have for things that are posted. Now, that's not, strictly speaking, a data privacy or cybersecurity issue, but it tends to fall in the general constellation of things that often lawyers who are dealing with these issues have some expertise in.
Mm-hmm. So just to paraphrase, there's sort of a patchwork quilt of different regulations depending on if you're talking about the state level, the federal level, maybe even the local jurisdictional level. In your expertise and your experience, what kind of challenges does this create when it comes trying to navigate this area?
Right. So the challenges depend on the perspective. If you're talking about a company that is trying to figure out its compliance obligations, it is a very complicated area, and especially if you're talking about a company that operates internationally, where there are regulations in every country that sometimes can have conflicts and at a minimum require different things depending on what jurisdiction you're operating in and or whose information you're collecting. So there is a substantial compliance burden that attaches to that. Now, from an individual's perspective, when you're trying to think about, well, how do I protect my own information? How do I get a handle on who has access to my information and what rights do I have with respect to them? It creates a different set of challenges. There is no single answer you can give to a person who's living in the United States. It depends where they live. It depends who has their information. And that's been one of the challenges surrounding changing regulations in this area, and no one's come up with with an easy answer that balances the compliance burden against the need for individuals to have protections and the ability to understand where their data is going.
And let me, without putting too fine a point on this question, why should the general Joe public be concerned about this? Why should they care?
Well, for a couple of reasons, right? As your intro highlighted, there are real direct individual level risks that can come about through lack of security, lack of privacy. On the security side, of course, you can be defrauded directly, right? Some of those phishing emails that you mentioned, or indirectly if another entity has your information and it gets disclosed, that can be used to create fake accounts, to do things in your name that you wouldn't otherwise want to. From a privacy perspective, obviously, we live in a world where we still have, although increasingly less so on a practical level, some expectation of privacy about what we do, and especially we do sensitive things. And to the extent that you don't know or aren't aware that by using your phone in a certain way, downloading an app to do one thing, if that data is being shared with other entities, in particular entities like data brokers, governments can get access to that information without a warrant under our current laws. And so you may be exposing yourself to having things that you're doing that you think are private, no longer private, because you're using an app for one thing and your information's getting put out there in other ways. And so those are the, generally speaking, those are the kinds of things that affect people on an individual level.
Wow. And what about elections, disinformation, that whole area?
Yeah. And so elections pose a different or related set of issues. So first of all, election information has some sensitive information directly involved in it. Elections themselves, we obviously want to be secure and valid, and they are a known target, persistent target of threat actors, especially on the international level, Russia in particular, but China, Iran, and others, because it would be incredibly disruptive to the United States if it was demonstrated that an election had been subject to, or that one state's election infrastructure had been subject to a hack and had been directly tampered with. That has never been demonstrated, but we know that there are persistent activities attempting to do things like that every election. A distinct set of issues related to elections are misinformation and disinformation. Now, these again are not data privacy concerns directly, and they're not even, for the most part, cybersecurity concerns. It's more the exploitation of primarily social media, but other outlets of information to create fake content, sometimes to try to maybe directly influence a race or an issue in an election, but more often than not, especially coming from the Russian side, persistent activities that are just designed to create mistrust in information and in the system that we have. And this we've seen in every election in recent memory, and increasing efforts to do that. And this relates to your question about, well, social media companies, what obligations do they have? And again, those legal issues are distinct from data security, data privacy, but election security researchers, there's a whole area that focuses on not just the direct securing of election infrastructure, but this misinformation, disinformation problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that can be a way for different actors to have an influence on voting patterns, different types of things.
Not necessarily a direct influence in terms of changing the outcome of an election, but undermining faith in the integrity of our system and just generally causing disruption in society.
And let me shift gears here a little bit. Relatively recently, the city of Cleveland experienced a cyber attack. I'm sure you were aware of that and were involved with that. What happened?
So I was aware of it, not involved at all. No insight into the details of it, but almost certainly it was a ransomware attack. And ransomware is a phenomenon that has been growing for many, many years. And what ransomware effectively involves is an attacker gets access to your system, embeds a script or takes advantage of the ability to exploit a vulnerability within the system, and ultimately locks up your access to your own system, and so freezes your ability to use your own data infrastructure, and then demands a payment in order to provide you the keys that will unlock your system. And so the rise of these kinds of attacks effectively turned anybody's system into a target. Whereas before ransomware emerged, primarily attackers were going after targets that had valuable information, bank accounts, healthcare information, these kinds of things. They still are, and those entities are still targets. But ransomware really opens the door to any company, no matter how large or small, any governmental entity, to being a target.
And is this happening more frequently?
So ransomware exploded and is a persistent problem. The way that many of these threat actor groups operate is effectively as a ransomware as a service. So they create the capability, the tool, and then they franchise it out and take a cut of other actors, and so who are employing the kit that they give them, in effect. And so it really operates like a business model where they can send it out in the world, offer it up. Maybe there's a payment up front to use it, and then some payment at the back end. And so that's what's created its ubiquity as a threat in society.
And the threat is they're going to corrupt or destroy the data itself, or potentially release it to the public?
So the main threat is just they're locking up your system. So a ransomware attack in its core form involves that. And so the fact that you cannot use your system unless you have really, really good backups, and even if you do, that will take some time and cost to get back up and running, gives them immediate leverage to demand payment. Now, often that will be paired with exfiltration of sensitive information and the threat that they would expose that information, in addition to having locked up your system. But the reason why ransomware makes anyone a target is irrespective of whether there's information that might be valuable in its own right or embarrassing if it were disclosed. Just locking up your system means, either you say, I'm gonna just restart, or use my backups, or you pay the ransom.
And another area that you focused on, it's fascinating, is surveillance systems that law enforcement departments may be using, smart cities, different operationalizations of digital technology to try to make some things operate more efficiently. So as one example, facial recognition software, which certainly can allow you to get onto your laptop or your iPhone more quickly, but there's other sorts of applications as well involved with this. Video camera surveillance in various public areas and things along those lines. For our audience, can you talk a little bit give us a little bit more of a definition of what this area is, and then what are the privacy concerns, the security concerns that we should be aware of?
Sure, and so the term smart cities is a sort of very broad term. It generally refers to using systems that have certain capabilities, usually capabilities related to algorithms or artificial intelligence, and data, to try to improve or maybe create new services that the government is providing. And so, of course, right away, you're talking about using information, using data, often sensitive information, collecting often more of it, and then processing it in ways that enable you to do things, right? So right away, you're talking about information being put into systems in ways that might make it vulnerable. So right away, you're thinking about, anytime you're talking about a smart city system, that smart city system is using it. It may use information that you already have, but you got to think through, okay, how are we securing that information? How does the access, the new access or the reconfigured access that we're providing to different entities create privacy risks? In addition, smart city systems always are expanding the capabilities of government to identify patterns within things and or collecting new information. So often when you're talking about security systems, it starts with cameras, often cameras that are more high resolution than in the past, and then layering into them capabilities like facial recognition, object recognition, automated license plate readers to be able to identify what's happening in the environment, either for civil reasons, because we want to know, hey, what are the traffic patterns? How many people are going on this? How do we need to prioritize maintenance or other things? Or for security reasons. So how do we, where do we deploy our police? There's been an incident here. We want to see who was there. We want to see what vehicles were there. We want to be able to try to track where those vehicles went and do something in real time. And so you're again expanding the capabilities of government, both on a civil side and on a policing side, to know more things about more people in real time and over time.
So what are the concerns?
Yeah, so the concerns are, especially when we're talking about the policing side of it, but it's hard to cleanly bifurcate the civilian and the policing side, because the police often will get access to the civilian data collection, are the big brother concern, right? Around how much information do we legitimately want government to have access to be able to do what it does, and in particular, how much information do we want the police to be able to access, and how comfortable are we with systems that can effectively create pretty extensive or identify pretty extensively patterns of movement about us over time, right? So take facial recognition, which has been in the news a lot and is a highly sensitive tool, right? Whenever you have a camera, especially a high resolution camera, you always will have access to someone's face, right? You don't have to do anything special about that. I don't have to agree to be in a system or not. If the government decides they're going to put in place a facial recognition system, either a live facial recognition system that gives them the ability to take a camera and say, hey, these are the people who are currently in view of the camera, or retrospectively use a system that layers onto footage and say, okay, these are the people who were in this area at that time. There's nothing stopping government from doing that except policies. And in some cases, laws. There are some cities and counties and other governmental entities who have passed laws that have banned facial recognition or restricted its use. But that's a tool that immediately gives us the ability, wherever our camera is, to figure out who was there or who is there now.
And are you aware of any examples where this was misused?
So,
or is it still too early?
No, absolutely. There have been multiple examples in the policing context where the police have believed they have identified someone, this is always retroactively, and then arrested that person, and it turns out they had the wrong person. Now, when that happens, it's almost always the case that they've been using the system in a way that it wasn't designed for. Either, and most often, having a probe image that comes from a camera that's not particularly high resolution, or the angle of it is not particularly high res, so that you're feeding it into it, and then demanding or requiring that the system give you, say, the top 10 closest, and then not having a threshold that says, hey, I'm only going to look at a quote match if it meets the threshold confidence criteria that, hey, this is a close enough match. They're just taking the top one and then going after someone. And so there are a number of practices that I worked with a large committee in the state of Ohio to put into place for Ohio's centralized facial recognition database that you should be following, including you should have a system that is vetted for that has been tested and proven to have high accuracy rates, and that you've got a process in place for only using that information after you've confirmed that you likely have a match, and then only using that if you've got supporting evidence, not using it on its own.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's almost a balancing act that goes on between the possible benefits of this versus the possible negative applications of these things.
Well, there's absolutely a balancing in terms of, are we going to use it, right? And when are we going to use it? And then the kind of issues I'm talking about are, if you're going to use it, you need to have quality control. You need to have policies in place and testing to ensure that the system you're using and the way you're using it gives you high confidence that when you are going to use it, you really do have a high likelihood of a match.
And let's now, this is a good launching point to talk about artificial intelligence, because I'm assuming that with some of this facial recognition software, that's being embedded into that as well. What should we be aware of as far as artificial intelligence, privacy, government issues, safety issues?
So artificial intelligence covers a broad array of different technologies. As you mentioned, any system like the facial recognition matching that I talked about is based on an algorithm, which we would call an artificial intelligence system. And then there are other multiple use cases for artificial intelligence. But at bottom, artificial intelligence is about using data to detect or inform government about different things. And so, of course, and the systems that are emerging now, the large language models and others, allow for much greater accuracy and much greater capability in terms of what you can do with that information and what kind of patterns you can identify. So it exacerbates those privacy concerns that I mentioned before, because now government is going to be able to figure things out about you, much more things about you, and at much more granular detail. So if you're going to use those systems, and the facial recognition system isn't, we can go back to that as an example, you want to ensure that the system you're using meets certain criteria. At minimum, it ought to be good at what it's supposed to be doing. You ought to be able to identify, hey, this system we're using for this purpose, and we have tested it to show it is highly accurate or accurate within the threshold we set, depending on what we're trying to do for that purpose. You need to be sure that it is non-discriminatory, right? So these systems are trained on large amounts of information. If that information is itself skewed in a demographic way, overrepresents white men, underrepresents women, things like that, then its accuracy will only be good for the data that it was trained on. And if you're going to then use it generally across populations for which it wasn't trained well and hasn't been tested to be accurate, then you run into real risk of discrimination. And then more broadly, most of the laws that are emerging, both in Europe and at the state level, require some form of transparency. The ability to know that, at least in sensitive situations like hiring or eligibility for government benefits, that, hey, you're using this system, and that you're and what the system is, and why you're using it, so that you can have the ability to challenge it, because often these systems, the more sophisticated systems, are what we call a black box, where the engineers who have created them, and certainly the people using them, cannot fully explain how it gets to the conclusion that it gets to. And so, given the risks of discrimination, privacy risks, we want to know, especially in these early days, hey, this is being used, and then ideally some documentation around they've been tested for this use case, demonstrated to be non-discriminatory, or at least not. There's always some discrimination risk, but that risk is small enough that we're comfortable with it.
And one final area, what about drones?
Oh,
You did some work with something
yeah.
a little bit more fun and lighthearted with that.
Well, I don't know if drones are fun and lighthearted, at least not in the context that I think about them. So I've done work with the Cleveland Policing Commission on their use policies for police surveillance technologies. And of course, drones is a recent one that came out. There's a pending use policy. Drones obviously bring these risks we're talking about into sharp relief, because it's a physical manifestation and a moving. It's basically a drone is for police purposes is a moving camera, right? So maybe if I'm particularly concerned about my privacy, I figured out where the surveillance cameras are in Cleveland, and I move around in ways to try to minimize my exposure to them. Really hard to do, but you could do it. A drone can go anywhere, right? And so, including above a house into private areas. So you really are concerned about drones being misused and expanding that capability to surveil people into areas that they have should have constitutional privacy protections under the Fourth Amendment. And drones are just kind of creepy, right? Like I hear a drone flying above me, I kind of wonder, well, what's going on, right? So, and then drones pose privacy risks, safety risks, right? You launch these things, and some of them are quite large. So there's a range of issues that you want to be really, really careful about when you're thinking about deploying drones. Although those issues, for the most part, outside of the safety issues, which are distinct to drones as opposed to cameras, are similar to the ones you worry about in terms of placing of cameras and what kind of capabilities you're layering onto them in terms of facial recognition, object recognition, and how you're using them.
Okay, that's great. Well, let's conclude by, what would you advise our audience to do to empower themselves, to protect themselves, to get involved in discussions of these types of things?
Yeah, so I would encourage people not to be afraid of these issues, in the sense that you think, as you said at the top, you're not a lawyer, you're not a technologist. It is not easy, but not that hard to get up to speed enough on how these technologies work and the risks that they pose to be able to talk intelligently about them, think about how you're using them in your own lives, but also to advocate for the kinds of policies that we want as a society. And one of the real risks that we see in this area, one of the real need for entities like the Policing Commission to be thinking about these is, if we just rely on government agencies to think about them, they're mainly focused on their practical mission. How can this help me do what I want to do? And not always focused, because there's less incentive to be, on the privacy and civil liberties issues that they raise. So we need citizens to inform themselves and to advocate for policies and laws, ultimately, that configure society in the way that we want it to be configured, and allow us to use these technologies in responsible ways, but put appropriate safeguards around them.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ray, for giving us some insight into this fascinating, rapidly emerging, and sometimes downright scary areas of cybersecurity, as well as data privacy and the like. So this concludes this episode of Cleveland Conversations, and thank you for watching.